It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, Northern Ireland Minister Conor Burns, Shadow Leader of the House of Commons, Thangam Debonair, Deputy Editor of Conservative Home, Henry Hill, and founder of the money-saving expert website, Martin Lewis. Today,
it's quite clear the apology didn't cut it in the eyes of many members of the public and in the eyes of many members of the Conservative Party, actually.
You don't condemn a man without the investigation, is my view.
Will the Prime Minister's fate be sealed by a civil servant's report? Keir Starmer is accused of breaking the rules in this video from April last year.
There is simply no comparison, and anybody who's trying to make the comparison is really just sinking in this mire.
She fought the government in the courts and won. But will Gina Miller's political party be a success? You'll have heard there in the headlines Nadeem Zahawi, a government minister, saying we should all wait for the outcome of the investigation into parties and events at Downing Street during lockdown. The investigation being carried out by senior civil servant Sue Gray. It's a name you will have heard an awful lot over the past week or so. And you should do that before deciding Boris Johnson's fate. So is her report, her investigation, a formality or a game changer? Conor, you don't think the Prime Minister should resign as we sit here today. Is there anything in Sue Gray's report, anything she can say at all that will change your mind?
Well, let's wait to see what she says. That's the whole point about asking Sue Gray, a senior civil servant of the utmost independence and integrity, to look at all of these matters in the context in which these events in Downing Street took place. The Prime Minister has been very clear. He regrets it. He said he apologises. He said in retrospect he wishes he'd ordered everybody inside. He's asked for space for Sue Gray to finish her report, which will then be published, and he's then undertaken, rightly, to come back to Parliament, make a statement and answer questions. I think we should reserve judgment until we know what Sue Gray finds.
Right, so there are things that she could say, things that she could find out in that report that might mean, in your mind, you conclude Boris Johnson should resign.
Which I want to wait to see what Sue Gray has to say.
So you're open on this issue?
Hypothetically, of course there are things that anybody could say in a report that would change the circumstances. I want to see what she says and then hear what the Prime Minister has to say when he, quite properly, says he will return to Parliament, make a statement and answer questions.
Thangam, you think the Prime Minister should resign immediately, right away. So is there anything that Sue Gray can say or find out in her report that will change your mind?
Well, the thing is, the Prime Minister shouldn't be hiding behind Sue Gray's report in any case. He doesn't need an inquiry to say what he has done and what he knew and when he knew it.
He did say that he was there at that party for 25 minutes.
So we already know that.
So there's nothing that Sue Gray can find or conclude in this investigation that will make the Labour Party, you, Keir Starmer, say, actually, we don't think he should resign.
He said he was there for 25 minutes. He knows it was a party. He knows it was against the rules. It's no use saying in retrospect. For anyone who that day could not say goodbye to a dying loved one, those 25 minutes would have meant the world. He didn't have any need to be there. He knew it was against the rules. Saying in retrospect he wished he'd done different is just not good enough. He should resign.
Martin, can your mind be changed by anything that comes out of this report?
I think it's going to be very difficult. I have chaired 2 charities. I've sat on an independent committee. I've been a governor of a university, all of which are subject to the Nolan Principles of Standards in Public Life. And there are 7 of those. 4 of them include integrity, accountability, honesty, and leadership. And I find it quite difficult that the modern political world seems to have changed from the old days, where if your department did something wrong, even if you were not personally culpable, as a minister, you would take responsibility and resign. Here we have the Prime Minister, who the one individual occasion he attended is quite bad, but clearly there was a failure of leadership within 10 Downing Street because we had party after party after party after party. And that means there is a real problem here. And I would like to see the Prime Minister take responsibility, and we need to start giving people trust in our politicians. It's something I've been passionate about for years. I often defend politicians. Most of them I meet are there for the right reasons, even if I disagree with them. But when it comes to something like this, we need to refresh our political integrity. And I think the Prime Minister, it's going to be very difficult to see that he shouldn't go. And the thing that really sticks in my craw about this, the argument that I've most upset me is Jacob Rees-Mogg, when he talks about we have to look at whether the rules were proportionate. Well, you made the rules. Whether they were proportionate or not, you made them, you stick by them, and if you didn't, you face the consequences.
All right.
The rest of us have to. One rule for one rule for all.
Henry, 6 Tory MPs have called on Boris Johnson to go. Where do you think most others are?
I think at this point most of them have probably concluded that it's a matter of when, not if. This fundamentally isn't about the technicalities of the rules. Sue Gray, if she does find that Boris Johnson broke the law, then that will be the end of that, I suppose. It will probably be the end of him. But really, I think part of the problem is that an awful lot of what was happening at the early stages of the pandemic was being done on guidance. The legislative framework for dealing with the pandemic wasn't in place. And one of the controversies of the time was how zealously the police were enforcing these regulations which didn't necessarily have the force of law. So the fact that they weren't enforcing them in Boris Johnson's case might not be the slam dunk that some of his supporters think it is. But I think the problem for Tory MPs is that this is a really bad time to have a Tory leadership election. The last thing you want is to be doing something like this if you're going into an NHS winter crisis or a cost of living crisis. So after the May elections would have been the ideal time. The question is, can we get there?
Right. Do you agree with Henry? It is a matter of when, not if.
No, I don't, because I think my colleagues, the majority of them, realise the Prime Minister during the pandemic got the big judgments right. The early procurement of the vaccine, we now see over 80% of the eligible population boosted. We look at the economy, more jobs now, more growth, GDP higher than it was at the beginning of the pandemic, record job vacancies, wage rates up. They see that because of the Prime Minister's judgment, we are in a position to open our economy earlier than most other comparable countries.
There is a cost of living crisis, according to the opposition.
We'll come on to that, but they think that he
so
got the big judgments right.
Right, well, on that, I mean, Henry, in your mind, does that mitigate what is unfolding now over the last few weeks or so about parties and events, about behaviour, about integrity that Martin Lewis is talking about? Does the sort of judgment on the big issues, if you're in agreement with what the government has done on those big calls, as Connor called them, somehow cancel out what's happened now in many voters' minds?
Manifestly it doesn't. You need only look at the polls to have the evidence of that. And over the weekend I was actually up in part of the Red Wall talking to Conservative councillors who won their seats in places like Rotherham on the back of Boris Johnson's popularity. And what they're saying is that in November they were going around areas and they were saying this is amazing, and now they've lost support.
Well, let's just show one example of that. This is opinion poll. 63% now think the Prime Minister should resign, nearly 3 times the 22% who think he should remain as Conservative Party leader. Connor?
I've got no doubt that there is a massive job, nor, by the way, does the Prime Minister, a massive job to do to rebuild trust after this. And I hope when we open the economy up again, when we end the restrictions, when we publish the Levelling Up paper, when we get back to a post-pandemic era of government, that he will be able to do that. It's only 2 years since he won a majority of 80, the biggest landslide since Margaret Thatcher in 1987, and I am convinced that when he gets back to talking directly to the British people about daily matters, that will recover.
But isn't that part of the problem, is that the Prime Minister, after having denied that anything went wrong and then denied that he knew about it, and then it turned out he did know about it, he's now mired in this, and he can't deal with the big issues of the day. We have a crisis in the Ukraine, we have an energy crisis, there's any number of things he ought to be dealing with, and as by your own admission there, he can't deal with them because he's mired in this. It's of his own volition. He chose not to admit to things that he obviously knew about all along. He waited till he was found out, and now here we are with a Prime Minister who can't run the country.
Well, I look forward, firstly, to somebody asking the Leader of the Opposition circumstances to be looked into in an independent inquiry and for her judgment to be formed, because Keir clearly broke the rules in the footage we've seen.
There's a world of difference between a beer over a takeaway in the middle of a campaign trail and a culture of
all Prime Ministers have to deal with a whole plethora of things all at the same time. I'm saying when we open the economy up, when we end the restrictions, and we can fully focus again on the domestic agenda, I think the Prime Minister will rebuild trust with the British people.
Martin, you were nodding along as Thangham was speaking just a moment ago. What were you agreeing with?
To an extent. I mean, I want any government of this country to succeed. I mean, that's the most important thing. And we are in a very difficult time now with the cost of living. We're coming out, I hope, of the pandemic. And some of the calls that have been made are good. The vaccine call seems to have been successful. I think the call over Omicron and the level of restrictions that were less than most people thought at the time seems to have been good. But you know, you can only be trusted if you're trustworthy. And I'm not sure there is a way back from this. For the Prime Minister, there may well be a way back for the Conservative Party under different leadership. But I think it's very difficult now, that, you know, on the back of what happened with Dominic Cummings, that the scar of that lasted such a long time. We now have this, but it's right. It's balanced and centred and focused right over the Prime Minister. I'm not sure there necessarily is a way back. And it surprises me that the party, which has often been so ruthless, doesn't see that. For the Conservative Party to survive, it needs to have a trusted figure at this point. And I'm not sure the Prime Minister is that trusted figure.
Connor?
Look, again, when Sue Gray's report comes out, when the full context of all these events is seen,
but
when
on that point about being a trusted figure, whatever Sue Gray says, Martin's point about the party might survive, but if you've lost trust and he is the man, Boris Johnson, leading the party, then the fate of the party is tied up with him.
I do not for a second underestimate the challenge there is for the Prime Minister, the government and the Conservative Party to rebuild trust with the British people.
With Boris Johnson still as Prime Minister?
I am absolutely convinced that Boris Johnson, given the space, will be able to do that.
All right. Well, Henry, when you were on the programme on Thursday, you said one of the key factors would be the response of constituents, of the electors themselves. Henry said that on Thursday. You went back to your constituency at the weekend. How angry are they?
I spoke to party members at a dinner on Friday evening. There were very clear messages they wanted me to convey to the Prime Minister and to the wider party about how we need to get a grip after this is over, what we need to do in terms of focusing on the priorities.
Did the majority of them want you to say he should go?
There were very few who felt that the Prime Minister should go. They wanted to refocus on the priorities that we were elected on in 2019. And by the way, Jo, looking at the inbox, which I will concede is pretty bad, it is no way near as bad as it was when Dominic Cummings did what he did.
Well, it's interesting because your fellow Dorset MP Chris Loder, speaking yesterday on Radio 4's Westminster Hour, said between 6 p.m. on Friday and 9 a.m. on Saturday, 106 emails crashed into the inbox. The rest of the day had just under 300. For me, in West Dorset, I know that is an enormous number. The vast, vast majority of those are critical of the Prime Minister.
Similar numbers we had on Badger Culls, on forest privatisation, on same-sex marriage over the years that I've been a Member of Parliament.
Henry?
We, Conservative Home, conducted a snap poll of our panel of Conservative activists and members that we run every month, and more than 50% of them thought that Boris Johnson should resign immediately. The people I've been talking to in the north of England are reporting that in council wards that they won by stonking majorities only a year ago, we're now losing by-elections, and that's all happened in the last couple of months. There is clearly deep public anger amongst Conservative voters about this.
Colin?
We've come back from very serious situations in midterms before, under Margaret Thatcher, under David Cameron in 2012, when we were significantly behind in the polls for sustained periods. And through leadership and focus on domestic priorities, we've been able to recover the position and win subsequent general elections. I'm convinced Boris Johnson can do that again.
Connor mentioned Keir Starmer and this image of the Labour leader, which we can show you on the front page of the Daily Mail. You saw it in the headlines too. Starmer must say sorry for drinks in lockdown. Now, you will know the rules then. This was April the 30th last year. Step 2 of lockdown, easing. You couldn't socialise indoors with anyone else apart from your family or your bubble. Should he say sorry? Did Keir Starmer break the rules?
No, that's not my understanding. This was in the middle of a campaign. The Hartlepool by-election was happening, and a beer over a takeaway on a pit stop to try and get some fuel down him in between campaign sessions is not anything close to the culture of partying which was clearly going on in Number 10. The culture of denial which is layered on top of that in Number 10. Keir Starmer has acknowledged that he had a beer over a takeaway in between campaign sessions, and I think that's exactly what happened, and that's what we can see a picture of.
It's not comparable to what was going
on.
on.
There's an easier way to clear it up. Keir Starmer could set up an independent inquiry and ask somebody to look at it in the same way the Prime Minister's done. Look, I think this is the reason why the Sue Gray report is very important, is to understand the context. The Prime Minister believes, and I believe him, that he was told he was asked to go to the garden to thank staff.
Oh, for goodness
and he did not see,
Connor, he didn't even admit that when he was first challenged on it.
And he did not see the email, the bring a bottle thing. But let's wait. Let's give Sue Gray the space to complete the report, and then the Prime Minister will come rightly to us to be accountable to Parliament and through Parliament to our constituents.
All right, Martin. I mean, is there a sense, because just before I put the question to you, I'm just going to show everybody this picture, which shows the terrace in Downing Street. It's actually actually from the 15th of May 2020, 5 days before the big event for which Boris Johnson has apologised. Is there any difference, I wonder, between that and the image of Keir Starmer, as Thangham Debonair has said, having a drink during a sort of working day or even at the end of it with colleagues, or is it a plague on all their houses?
I think there is a difference to something that's organised with inside Number 10, and the fact is that's one picture, and we know it was repeated in Number 10. I mean, Keir Starmer will have to take a hard look at what he did and whether he should be saying he didn't quite get it right. But I think the big difference is Keir Starmer isn't the one making the rules. Boris Johnson is the one making the rules. And what I would like to ask Conor, I'd like to understand. I mean, the Prime Minister is the head of Number 10. It's his house, it's his office, and he's the Prime Minister. Is he not responsible for what goes on in Number 10? Is that not a principle of politics, that a minister is responsible for his department, and for the Prime Minister, well, it's everything, but it's especially Number 10. So regardless of whether he was there and whether he knew that email was going out, isn't this a question of the culture of leadership that he set up was lacking?
Well, I think it's fair to say, Martin, that the Prime Minister is not responsible for what happens in every room in the vast Downing Street complex, in the same way that I and my Secretary of State will not know what's going on in every room in the Northern Ireland office, both in Horse Guards and also across the estate in Northern Ireland. And the question, the Prime Minister is accountable for what the Prime Minister himself did, and that's what we're going to find out when Sue Gray publishes her report.
Now, the government has...
That's what I don't... Sorry, that's what I don't understand. I thought there was Prime Ministerial responsibility for the operation of a department. You said he didn't know about it. I didn't ask about whether he knew. I asked about responsibility. Is that not a principle of governance? Is he not responsible for the department?
The Prime Minister is responsible, quite rightly, for the actions of his government, for the policy decisions he's made. He's responsible for the vaccine. If that had gone wrong, by the way, he'd be culpable for wasting billions of pounds had the vaccine's been ineffective. He's responsible for restrictions. And when you say, you know, Keir Starmer were in charge, if Keir Starmer was in charge, we'd probably still be in lockdown.
That's absolutely ridiculous. And you know it. The Prime Minister, Number 10 has had to apologise to the Queen. To the Queen.
And
absolutely atrocious behaviour.
I'm not going to prejudge Sue Gray's report, but where was the Prime Minister on that evening? Where was the Prime Minister on that evening?
It's the Prime Minister's
government. He was not in Downing Street.
So is he not responsible?
Is he not responsible for the culture in his own department? Yes or no? Of course he is.
It is not for the Prime Minister to know what is going on in every room across the vast Downing Street and Cabinet Office estate. And we will establish all the facts when Sue Gray's report is published.
Hiding behind Sue Gray's report.
And the Prime Minister, we're not hiding behind it. We set up an independent inquiry. Will Keir set up one? Will he set up an independent inquiry into what he did?
A culture of partying week after week, a culture of denial.
Boris Johnson has
repeatedly denied that he knew anything about anything, and then it turns out he did. That is really problematic.
Well, let's juxtaposition this discussion that you are having about who takes responsibility for what, because the newspapers over the weekend were full of a raft of reports that the Prime Minister intends to pursue a two-pronged strategy, many of them saying to save his own skin. The first is to sack Number 10 staff to save himself, so-called Operation Save Big Dog. The second is to announce a number of policy commitments which has been billed Operation Red Meat. Henry, I'll get you to explain the politics behind that in just a moment. Let's look at one of them in the Times. Prime Minister calls in military to stem flow of migrants. What is this strategy? Is it going to work?
I mean, I wouldn't have thought so. I think, first of all, again, if you talk to any of the voters who are really angry about this, they're not going to be like, oh, well, he's got rid of some people in Downing Street, therefore my trust in the Prime Minister is restored. But I think the other problem with this strategy is that, for example, with the military in the Channel, the military don't change anything. They don't have the legal framework, the legal challenges, the very real challenges with dealing with small boats remain exactly as they are. Just the fact that you're putting soldiers in there doesn't change anything. And I think part of the problem is that you've basically got a raft of very retail policies when we're still theoretically 2 years out from a general election. So this isn't really what the government should be doing at this point. 2 years out, having lost 2 years to the pandemic, is showing that it can invest in real reform, big stuff, planning. And instead we're getting this raft of measures which won't endure until the general election.
Conor?
Well, look, as a minister, firstly, I've never heard of this big dog stuff. I've read about it, but I've not heard about it officially in government.
But what do you make of this list of policies, one of which I've just read? We'll go on to another one in just a moment, coming out at this particular time, Operation Red Meat, as it's been dubbed.
I know that there has been conversation across government, because I've been involved in them, about when we open up the economy fully, when the restrictions end, when we get back fully and properly, rather than focusing significantly on the pandemic to focusing on the priorities for which we were elected only 2 years ago, what are the raft of measures that we will want to prioritise? I think that's quite legitimate for a government to consider.
Right, well, this is another one. Let's show you this tweet from the Culture Secretary, Nadine Dorries. This is about the BBC licence fee. This licence fee announcement will be the last. The days of the elderly being threatened with prison sentences and bailiffs knocking on doors are over. Time now to discuss and debate new ways of funding, supporting and selling great British content. What did you make of that, Henry? Is that new?
Yes, in a way. There's been a long-running Conservative campaign to do something about the licence fee, but I think that there's a very serious conversation to be had about the licence fee, but I think this is not the time or the manner in which to do it, because it sort of poisons the well, because it's perfectly possible as a Conservative to wish the BBC well and to recognise its importance, whilst understanding that there might be a case to be made for changing the way that it's funded. But if you're throwing out this kind of announcement and accompanying it with a tax on wokery in the aftermath of the government being in extreme difficulty, it doesn't look like that's what your motivation is, does it?
And it's really problematic that yet again we have a government minister announcing government policy on Twitter rather than to Parliament. Big announcements, and this looks like she's signalling a big announcement. We don't actually know the details of any of this because she's just tweeted about it, not come to Parliament as is right and proper so she can be scrutinised by MPs.
Look, as far as the BBC is concerned, I sat on the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee years ago where we concluded in a report into the future funding of the BBC that the licence fee as a tax on a device that sits in the corner of a living room was drawing to a close, and that we would probably be ending up, this would probably be the last licence fee in its current form. Even your former Director General, Tony Hall, acknowledged that he thought time was up on this particular funding mechanism. So I think this is absolutely the right sort of thing that Secretary of State for Culture should be bringing forward to have a public debate about it. Absolutely.
In a tweet, or should it have gone to Parliament first?
Well, she is putting it out there, and we will.
She certainly is. Martin, will this help your readers? Will it help this freezing the licence fee, which is the other part of what Nadine Dorries said on Twitter, freezing it for at least 2 years?
Well, I mean, what is it? It's about a £16 saving, and obviously we've got the £600 a year rise in energy bills, and I think that would be, if I were in government and I wanted to focus on the cost of living, that's what you need to be focusing on. What interested me about this, and while I support some of the sentiment that decriminalisation of the licence fee, I mean, I think it is not a good thing that there are so many people who are criminalised by not paying the licence fee. You know, it should be contractual like other things. But the first part of her statement says, this is the last time we'll have the licence fee. And then later on she goes, we need to debate forms of funding and how it's going to be funded. And that seems slightly a strange way to make an announcement for me. Surely if you're going to announce the licence fee is gone and there's no other chance, you need to know what it's going to be replaced by. And there's problems with all the models. I mean, if you do advertising, then you may well kill off ITV, which is where I have my show, so I hope that doesn't happen. I mean, if you do a subscription service, then how are you going to charge certainly older people who don't access radio and television and regional via the web? How are you going to charge a subscription service? So we don't have the mechanics for the replacement, and it seems rather strange to have a policy where you're saying we absolutely won't do this bit, but we have no clue what we're going to do instead.
All right.
So that does feel a bit knee-jerk, doesn't it?
Those are the models, and Martin is absolutely right. We don't yet know exactly what might be proposed. But in terms of the cost of living, in terms of relieving the pressure on people's household bills, what about freezing it for 2-3 years?
Well, I think Martin mentioned there that the real problem with the cost of living at the moment isn't the licence fee, it's the fuel bills, and Labour already has a plan on that. You know, £600 at least that people's bills are going to go up by. We would scrap the VAT temporarily, which would give people a relief of £200, plus an extra £400 to those 9 million people who have the lowest incomes. That is a plan. Now, the government doesn't seem to have a plan, and a tweet about the BBC is not a plan. Keir Starmer has a plan. We could actually deal with this, and what I'm not seeing from the government at the moment is an attempt to deal with the cost of living crisis.
Right, well, let's have a look at that in a little bit more detail, including energy bills rising. If I can show you here the Times headline, rising energy bills unaffordable for quarter of households. That's the warning from think tank Resolution Foundation today, as bills are expected to soar on the 1st of April when energy regulator Ofgem raises, as we expect, the price cap for the maximum people can pay on their energy bills. Martin, what does unaffordable mean in real terms?
I believe the Resolution Foundation's definition is more than 10% of their income will go to pay fuel bills. And look, I've been campaigning loudly on this. I first asked the question about the energy crisis to the Energy Minister when I was presenting Good Morning Britain last June. This is not unexpected. I did a programme predicting £600-ish price hikes last November. This is not unexpected. We now have the Resolution Foundation report. We're now firmed up because the end of the assessment period for the price cap is the end of this month. It's a 6-month period. The range is, it's going up unless there is a change, somewhere between 46 and 56%. Now, there is not actually such a thing as the price cap. It's really a rate cap. But for someone on typical bills, it's £600. Now, we know that that first price cap will last from April until October. In that 6-month period, on average, people, vulnerable people and those on lower incomes are going to need £300 just to keep them in the expensive position that they are in right now. And unfortunately, it's likely rates are going to go up again next October, so even more will be needed. So the first thing we need to focus on is making sure those people get that money. Now, I know Labour has the VAT policy. I think that's a bit of a blunt tool because it helps everyone. In a way, you could argue that you would be better off to keep the VAT and use the money from that to pump it towards the people who will simply be choosing between whether they freeze or they starve. And that is not an exaggeration in some homes.
All right.
We are in that position. The mechanics of how you do it, by the way, don't really matter. Expand the warm home discount and pay £300 there. Do it through universal credit. Have a vulnerable customer price gap. None of it matters. You just got to do it.
Well, it was pretty stark. So freeze or starve. But first of all, a blunt tool. It would be better targeted.
I think that what we've got in our plan is two elements. One which is very sharply targeted on those 9 million people who are the most vulnerable on the lowest incomes, and that's the extra £400. But people on quite modest and middle incomes are also going to struggle. So that's why we thought the VAT cut for a temporary VAT cut would help people to the tune of £200. But also we've not mentioned businesses who are also going to struggle. Those energy-intensive businesses, we would also have a £600 million fund to help them as well, because that would affect jobs and livelihoods. So we're looking at the whole process. And as Martin says, we've known about this for months. Right. Where's the government's plan? I don't see one.
Well, Martin, do you want to respond? And then I'm going to go to Connor.
I do think it's a blunt tool, but at least it's a tool. And we need something. I mean, we desperately need something. It needs to be remembered. While people think April is not a particularly cold month, so people will be fine, what happens is direct debits, which is what the most people are billed by, will go up immediately on the 1st of April in proportion for the whole year on that, for someone on typical bills, £600 a year. This is going to hit pockets straight away. And we do benefits amounts once a year. And when you're in an inflationary period, what might just get people by at the beginning of the year, after you've gone through a year and you've had fuel rises and everything else, it will no longer be enough.
All right.
This is a peculiar and unprecedented situation, and we need peculiar and unprecedented moves from the government to fix it.
I mean, a choice of freezing or starving on your watch, Connor.
Well, the first thing to say, Jo, and Martin was generous enough to acknowledge this morning in his interview on your radio broadcast programme today, that this is an international problem. We are not.
But it's something that the government has known and should have expected for some time. So do you accept that you have been sleeping at the wheel?
No, I don't. The Secretary of State for BEIS, Kwasi Kwarteng, is in extensive conversations with the energy companies, but we should look at what the government has already done on this. 500 million through the Household Support Fund delivered to local authorities to get targeted support to people who need it. The £120 rebate on energy bills for 2.2 million low-income homes. The £300 winter fuel payments to more than 11.4 people of pensionable age. That should serve, I hope, as an encouragement of the direction of travel of what the government has been prepared to do in the past to help the most vulnerable. And I await what the Secretary of State for Energy and Business is having, the conversations he's having.
Martin?
Look, stuff has been done, and it's all an improvement. I mean, if we take one example, the warm home discount, which is paid to vulnerable people, that is currently £140. The proposal 6 months ago was to raise it to £150. It's been frozen for at least 5 years, and we're seeing a 50% rise in April. The problem is we are tinkling in the wind here compared with what we need to do. We can do the maths very simply. We know from April we're likely to see, on average, £600 per person rise in bills, and some people are already in fuel poverty before that happens. The Resolution Foundation is saying 6 million people will be in fuel poverty on the back. Well, £600 times 6 million people is £3.6 billion. That is the scale of the cost here. Now, it may come out of government debt, it may come out of general taxation, or it may come out of windfall profits. I'll leave that to people who look at that side. From my side, I am swamped with people scared and desperate that they are not going to be able, they're elderly, heat themselves, they're not going to be able to feed their children. This is an unprecedented moment. This is not attacking the government. I think the government has been a bit slow, but you've still got time to fix it. It is interesting, though. I keep hearing about these meetings with the energy companies. I don't know the consumer groups have ever been invited. You're talking to the suppliers. You're not talking to people who look at what consumers do, and perhaps you need to balance both.
Connor?
Well, you've made that point very clearly. I'm very happy to convey that separately to the Secretary of State. I do know those conversations, Martin, are ongoing, and you were generous in acknowledging that we have done some stuff in the past, and I hope that will serve as a demonstration of intent that this government has been prepared to get alongside the poorest, most vulnerable in society to protect them when we have been presented with these problems, and I'm confident that we will be taking action on this in the coming months.
I mean, what does that action look like, do you think, in your mind? Unprecedented. It needs unprecedented action, says Martin, because of the figures that he has set out of people who could potentially fall into fuel poverty.
Well, you know the challenge of being a government minister. You can't act as a commentator at the same time. I know the responsible ministers are having those conversations and looking at this problem in depth. We recognise it, and I'm sure they'll be coming forward with remedies.
I mean, how difficult is this issue? Cost of living crisis, as Labour call it, and many Tory MPs also feel more needs to be done in terms of managing those soaring energy costs. How big an issue is it?
I mean, one of the advantages of having an imminent Tory leadership election is that you will probably find the Chancellor is willing to pay for this in the end. But it is a serious issue for the Conservatives because it hits actually on a cross between two parts of their agenda. Because on the one hand, Boris Johnson won on a kind of making life better, generally better for ordinary people, and cost of living goes right to the heart of that. But at the same time, the government has signed up to a lot of very tough legal commitments on things like net zero, which committed to, for example, green levies on energy prices. And so this is one of those areas where those two agendas come into conflict, and what we're actually seeing, especially amongst MPs who were elected in 2019 after the net zero commitment was made, is that there's a sense of political feeling that we could do more about this. And I'm not saying this is right or wrong. There's this sense we could do more about this if we just eased back on some of those commitments. So it becomes very politically difficult for the government in some respects.
Of course, some of the renewable stuff we're doing actually means more certainty of supply here in the United Kingdom rather than being reliant upon international supply chains. So some of that actually gives us resilience going forward.
I wasn't criticising net zero. I'm just saying this is the feedback I'm getting from some MPs.
Martin, you were nodding away.
Yeah, I'm just nodding. There is an implicit conflict often between saving money and green. I was asked recently by a channel to present a programme and be the front of green investing, and I'd said, while I support it, for me, a lot of what people who are on low incomes have to do is not pro-green, and we have to, in the long run, make things effective and efficient so that people can take a green choice without having to pay more when they can't afford to do so. So we need to support renewables in the long term, but we also need to recognise that in the short term, having them on people's bills in a point of crisis is going to mean some very vulnerable people paying more money than they should.
Yes.
And I don't. If I can be really honest, the big problem that all parties have had with the energy system is they haven't really understood it. And you've had one hand, some people argue we need to lock in prices, nationalise, and that may not be the most efficient way. I'm not particularly opposed to it. On the other hand, we've had the right saying we need a market-based solution, which can be efficient. But what's really happened here is we have never defined who are the legitimate victims of the market and who are the illegitimate victims of the market. Now, we're in a peculiar time where you can't say by switching at the moment, but Jo, if you had never switched your bills to be on the cheapest tariff, for me, you're an intelligent woman, you're a legitimate victim. That's fine. You had access, you didn't do it. But for years, there have been struggling 90-year-old grandmothers with onset dementia who pay more to boil a kettle than I do. And that is a real problem, and the market doesn't solve it. So I've always been in favour of, I've called it a vulnerable customer price cap, a much lower price cap for people who are particularly vulnerable. We still need to have some moral hazard for using too much energy, but we need to protect people's prices who can't afford it. I don't think we've got it right.
Would you be in favour of something like that?
Speaking as a private citizen and a backbench, formerly a backbench MP, yes, I would. I mean, I was chair for a time of the All party group on financial fraud and scamming, and I recognise the vulnerabilities, particularly of those who don't necessarily do technology. On the market point, look, I'm actually quite sympathetic to this, that sometimes the government has to intervene. So, for example, 99% of solar capacity has come since 2010, when David Cameron and George Osborne took a very deliberate decision to step in and subsidise, to create the space in the market, to create that capacity.
Except picking up on something else that Martin said, that a lot of your colleagues
but then you dropped the subsidy. They dropped the subsidy.
The subsidy was to bring the capacity in and to allow entrance into the market. When we created the capacity, then it was right the state stepped back.
Is this the time to drop the green levies, as many of your Conservative colleagues have said?
On this one, I want to let the Secretary of State have those conversations.
Well, you must have a view. Should the green levy stay or should they go?
Well, I think we have to balance the needs of the consumer with our obligations as a country to the sustainability and the future of the planet.
All right, let's talk about a different kind of party from the ones that we were talking about earlier on in the show, the True and Fair Party. It's a new political party. It was launched last week by the businesswoman and political activist Gina Miller. You will remember her from the Brexit period, when she made headlines after taking the government successfully to court over Theresa May's attempts to trigger Article 50, which was the Brexit process to leave the EU without approval from the House of Commons. And here she is. Gina, hello to you. What motivated you to set up this party?
Looking at the systemic failures in our political system, which is being highlighted every day by Boris Johnson and the behaviour in Number 10, it's about not just getting caught up in the emotive day-to-day headlines, but actually looking at what we need to do to restore confidence in both the political system, our political class, and being able to hold them to checks and balances. And our own research shows that 71% of people do want to see these systemic changes and for checks and balances to be put into legislation, so we can get on with dealing with policy making rather than looking at, what have they done wrong today.
Right. Gina, obviously stay with us. I mean, Thangham, there is an implicit criticism there that the opposition, the Labour Party, Liberal Democrats, aren't doing enough to create the room for a party like Gina Miller's.
Well, I mean, I think that when we talk about values like truthfulness and fairness, that's what people reach to the Labour Party for. Keir Starmer has set out a really strong platform. We've got a good set of policies and principles going forward. We know that we're ahead in the polls. We also know that Keir Starmer has put together a really cracking top team, in my view. Obviously, I'm slightly biased. And I think those are the values. Fairness, in particular, is something that people have always turned to the Labour Party for. And as I said, at the moment, I see people turning to the Labour Party and hearing that from us and being welcoming of it.
Right. Well, Gina, is that
none of the proposals have a legal basis. This is a problem. You can't just have a system that is just hoping that people behave with honour in an old-fashioned system. We've got to have legislative footing so that we can actually make sure that we keep those in power to account.
And I believe in reforming the Ministerial Code and the standards of behaviour in public life and also for MPs. There is a review at the moment going on. I urge all MPs and others to take part in it, in the which the Committee on Standards is conducting. And then Lord Geit and the Ministerial Code. There's loads of things there which we ought to change and improve. And Labour's actually got a plan for doing that. And I agree that we need to strengthen it.
But not on a legislative basis. This is the problem, and it doesn't go far enough. I mean, if you look at that, it's all very well talking about just the Ministerial Code, but there's a lot of other things in the system that needs fixing. We actually need to, and that's what we're talking about, is systemic change across the political classes and also public institutions, because people's trust are at the lowest level. I mean, just look what's happening with the Met Police at the moment. There's a dereliction of duty there. Why are they not investigating the parties in Number 10? Because actually, Sue Gray doesn't have any legal standing for her report. She's evidence gathering when it's actually the police that should be doing the evidence gathering, because the Prime Minister himself has actually acknowledged and apologised to Parliament and Buckingham Palace.
All right,
so we now know that this has happened.
Well, having set out, as you say, the things you want to do, put it on a legislative footing, or certainly more of the political system. Let me just show everybody this tweet. It's from a Telegraph journalist, Tony Diver. It is the launch room where you were. It was sparsely attended. I'm sure you will admit the event. According to reports, there were 13 people present, although, as you would say, the COVID regulations made it more difficult to attend. Go on, Gina.
Yeah, because it was a virtual event. We were following with Omicron. We were having a virtual event, and I do find it quite bemusing that apparently, with nobody watching online, that they've all managed to write it up and write about my speech. So I think we did a virtual event, we did the right thing, and they have not concentrated on what we were saying. They're concentrating on the trivia, and I'm more interested in what it is we're actually offering the British people.
Gina Miller says there is room for a political party like hers because of the loss of trust, the lack of integrity put on a legal footing in the political system. She's talking about a Conservative government under Boris Johnson.
Well, look, I've seen these political parties come and go in the past. I remember David Icke starting a political party. I remember Paul Judge starting a political party. I would encourage people to get involved in the main political parties and use those as the vehicle. But I have to be very honest, Jo, and I'd say this being candid to Gina, there'll be many people looking at home and think the most egregious breach of trust was when 17.4 million British citizens voted to leave the European Union, and you and many others, inside and outside Parliament, used every mechanism available to you to try and overturn that
Connor,
democratic result.
Connor, I'm sorry, but that is blatantly
and it was
untrue.
Boris Johnson
my two
who delivered it.
My two cases, I'm sorry, were actually so that you had a voice, because both Theresa May and Boris Johnson were putting themselves above the law, as we say there, Mr. Johnson is trying to do again, because he was shutting the door on you, our elected representatives. So I would have thought you'd be very pleased that I actually brought those cases, so you were allowed to be part of the process of representing us and your constituents. So
I am very proud to serve under a
anything.
Prime Minister who delivered for the 17.4 million people and got us out of the
but he put
European
himself,
Union
I'm sorry,
as they
he
voted
lied to
for
the
in that
Queen and he
referendum.
tried to shut down Parliament.
He lied to the Queen, he tried to shut down Parliament, says Gina.
He was facing a situation where people were working, using every endeavour
But you're not
available to
denying
them
it, Connor.
to overturn Parliament, to overturn the election,
lie to the Queen.
the referendum result.
Gina?
It had nothing to do with the referendum result. If Connor would go back and look on the day after the referendum and the win by the Leave voters, I said we're all Brexiteers now. But that does not mean you have to put yourself above the law. You're trying to mix up two things that are not connected.
Can I ask, Gina, where is the appetite, do you think, for what you are proposing? It is a fairly crowded field politically. Where's your support going to come from?
Well, we will have to see where that lands, but from all the research we've done, it shows that there are people who are really fed up of the idea of a very ideological-driven policy making and actually want policies and political positions that are about the country and sustainability and taking long-term solutions rather than just on a short-term idealistical basis. So it's about working with experts for us to come up with policies. And when we've looked at all the research in the country, there are a considerable number of people who actually want to see change.
Well, let's ask our expert, who's here. Martin, do you agree with Gina?
I think there are people who will want change, and there are some people whose Gina's message will appeal to. But whether that has anything like the weight needed to be able to challenge the mainstream parties that have been embedded so many years, I mean, I am sceptical of. I do remember there was money put into some of those centrist parties a few years ago, and I got calls actually asking a couple of them quite serious whether I'd be interested in fronting them. To which I said I'd prefer to have my nipples wired to electrodes. My mental health certainly isn't robust enough. So I think Gina is very brave to do what she's doing. I think, unfortunately, what we've seen in the past is if you want to you can sway on certain issues, and the Women's Equality Party is out there, and it does it in a rather than always opposing. It's trying to work with different parties as well.
All right.
But if you want to form a mainstream new political party of your own, I think it's very difficult in this country's first past the post system to get anywhere.
Yeah. Henry, what do you think the chances are? Connor mentioned Change UK, which people may remember was the party made up of breakaway Labour MPs fed up with Jeremy Corbyn and 3 Conservative MPs. It didn't last very long.
No, I think with the best will in the world, non-existent. These is a very narrow range of issues, which I don't think has to break through in first past the post. You really need like an electorally concentrated base of support. What slightly baffles me, really, with greatest respect to Gina, is why not just do this through the Liberal Democrats? This is an agenda that fits in very well with what they're doing. They're an existing party. Why not join them? I don't see the case for building an entirely new party. And of course, there's no such thing as non-ideological policy making. You just either acknowledge your ideology or you don't.
Gina, we've only got 10 seconds. Will you stand as an MP?
I am hoping to.
All right, well, that was fair enough. Thank you very much from all of us here. It's all we have time for. Goodbye, and I'll be back tomorrow at 12:15 with more Politics Live.